In this season, we've been talking about receiving God's love. What a huge blessing, and how life-changing to recognize the love of God for us, like Paul talks about in Romans chapter 5. That justification is when God picks us up, and it's all His work. And regeneration is His implanting new life in us, and literally everything changes. We're new creatures in Christ Jesus. But a part of that reality is that it's never an end in itself. That God plans to work in us and through us that His love might be made known to all the world. We've been looking at the Gospel of John. Last week we looked at chapter 14 and the union of our lives with Christ. And this week we looked at John chapter 17. And again, at the end of that high priestly prayer of Jesus, there is the expression of that union of love with Christ. But in Jesus' prayer in John 17, there's the obvious outflow of that love for the whole world. That the world would literally experience the love that God has planted in our hearts. Nestled away in the middle of that prayer, in verse 22 of John 17, is this promise that He has given us His glory. And that becomes for me the defining element in all of this huge expression of love that God has in mind for the world. For the glory is a huge idea in the Gospel of John. In fact, Marcus Dodd says it's the concept that holds all of the Gospel of John together. The Gospel begins with this promise that the Word has become flesh and we have seen His glory. And so the whole Gospel is full of glory. John does something that is hugely unique in the New Testament and is very informative. When you come to the end of the Gospel and he begins to talk about glory, we begin to see in this Holy Week, John talks about the suffering and the agony and the crucifixion of Jesus, not in terms of sacrifice, but in terms of glory. That Jesus is glorified on the cross. In fact, the cross becomes the supreme expression and the place of God's glory. That is very informative for all of us. We begin to understand that we reach the world not by our victory and our power and our joy and our triumph, but through following the pathway and the pattern of Christ, where selfless serving the world is an expression of His glory, and that glory literally turns the world upside down. The first miracle of Jesus caused the disciples to believe, not because the water became wine, but because they saw His glory. May the Lord help us this Holy Week to be those that live in His glory. Not just victory and triumph with a smile on our face, but selflessly giving ourselves to Him. And then the world will know His great love. Thank you for joining us for a brief study of John 17, 20 to 26. Take time to read it. And thanks again for meeting us for just the meat and potatoes.